Chris Bedford with the Blaze Media. And we have Natalie Winters, co-host of Steve Bannon's War Room. I'll let you guys take it away.
Thank you, and thank you for CPI for hosting us. Welcome to Off the Record. And first things first, everyone's got a card on their seats, they can scan that, they can get access to the clips, social media, everything else that you might need, and it automatically downloads CPI into your phone where they can read your text messages and have right to your images. Natalie, thanks for coming.
Hi.
Are you ready for this?
Yes, I'm ready.
Fantastic.
I've been broadcasting for 1/8 of the day already. That's 3 hours, but we will make it a fourth.
That's good math.
Steve's
That was
been
quick.
sick. Don't tell anyone. He's never sick. He's never taken time off. Even when he was in prison, he was still kind of working.
Did he get
legally.
prison fit?
You know, this is my one commentary on Steve's exit from the prison. I think it was a very unfortunate photograph. They had him in this like gray. It was not the gray sweatpants meme that you typically see where it's like, oh, they look really good in the gray sweatpants. It was a very bad photo, but I do think he did lose weight. He loved being there. I always ask him, like, did you really like being in prison? He's like, yes. I'm like, no, but really, did you like being? He's like, yes, it was great. I was serving my country. It's like, that's an interesting.
It sharpens the mind.
You know, sometimes I'm like, I could do a 4-month stint. Maybe 4 years from now I will get that. But
I've also seen.
Although women's prison may be a little different. I don't know.
It depends if it's in California. It's kind of the same thing.
I could become trans and go to a male prison.
No, I've also seen the way he dresses up for like Glamour magazine photo shoots, and it's
a lot of
gray
Barber.
sweatpants and some Barber as well.
A lot of New Balance.
But you've also been working. You've spent a lot of time in the press briefing room, which is kind of like being stuck in an airport lounge with bad air conditioning and the worst people on the planet for hours and hours waiting for something like maybe the plane will take off, maybe something will happen. So how do you like it?
Well, I'm so glad I got to do this event because that means I did not have to go to the White House today. So that's the main reason that I consented to doing this. There is so much to unpack from being there. I think I have become sort of the front man for a lot of the attacks that they've used to impugn what the White House is trying to do with the new media stuff. They've obviously come after what I wear, what I do, what I say. Though it's quite interesting.
They got pretty weird in that Politico piece. Really
Politico
strange.
published foot pics of me. And for some reason, my name was in the website, like the search engine optimization. I was like, wow, you guys, times must be tough. You guys are really grifting off me. That was after the Daily Mail, the Hooters. I apparently dressed like a Hooters waitress at the White House. All that aside, that's me trauma dumping. No, but it's quite an interesting vibe. I'll give you the story of me walking in the first day because I think it's quite illustrative. Their jaws dropped when I opened the briefing room door, and I'm sure everyone has the same experience. For those of you who've been in there, you're like, wow, this room is so tiny. I didn't even know it was multi-level. There's like offices in the bottom, and some man came up to me and was like, wow, now that Trump is back, the pretty girls are back. There's no more girls with purple hair.
Somebody was autistic enough to say that.
Well, or he was just a Democrat and trying to get me to go to a basement with him, because then he's like, let me give you a tour, and took me to the basement.
It's like a submarine down there.
It was really gross. But to give you a substantive answer to your question, it's an interesting split. So the foreign press is actually very kind to me and to War Room. They think Steve is so cool. It's how America should be. They're like, oh, you work for Steve Bannon. Wow, like you're amazing.
It's because they're all assets.
Well, yeah, and I tell them everything. I'm like, Steve's great. Yeah. But there's an interesting spread, I think, among the legacy people. At first, I think they had more of an air of superiority, though to me it was kind of derived from their like weird pseudo-intellectualism. But then once they actually got to know me, then now I think they're like, oh, wait, all these new media people in here are actually wonderful sources. So now my phone, instead of getting, texts of the latest Daily Mail hit piece, it's now a bunch of WAPA reporters texting me like, hey, I just heard this broke. Do you have any sourcing in the ad? I'm like, no, I'm not going to give you that. I see what you guys write about me. No.
You're the only Trump voter they know, right? So they feel like they have to reach out.
I'm the token, the token MAGA person.
What does MAGA think?
Well, I also think, too, taking a step back, like this idea that we're the new media, First and foremost, I think it's a horrible monolithic term because under that umbrella, you have, Steve Bannon's War Room, even outlets like Lindell TV, which is really focused on, say, like election integrity versus outlets like the Daily Wire, which are not traditionally pro-Trump. They were originally, right, never Trump at that. And all of those outlets together, then you have Axios and Semaphore, right, which don't necessarily comport with the Bannon worldview. So it's an interesting application, I think, of that term. But you're seeing such a rush now, right, to covering us and covering the new media, and we're not really all that new. That's what I kind of keep pushing back, and the way that they approach us, it's as if, they don't know how to do the pieces, they don't know some basic stuff about shows like War Room, which I think are quite impactful for those of you who work on the Hill. I'm sure you've probably gotten the phone calls from our audience, and for that, I apologize. We tell them to be respectful. But they're so late to the game, and I think they're only covering it because they've kind of been forced into it. But they don't want to. And then I think even taking the politics out of it, that briefing room, I always describe it as very Darwinian in the sense that those networks have undergone so many layoffs, right? They're hemorrhaging viewership, they're hemorrhaging hopefully the big pharma ads, RFK, where are you? But, it's a slimmed down staff. So the people who are there are like arguably the best of the best, maybe the worst of the worst, who've stuck around. And I think that there's this maybe envy, right, when you see outlets like War Room or some of these new media where, we're not, struggling for cash. Our shows are only expanding. Our viewership is.
They push their hair back like mean girls in high school when I asked the question.
Do they have hair? I think a lot of them don't.
Yeah. The ones in the front row still do. Everyone else.
Well, take this for example. And this is now just going to be a
male pattern baldness comes for us all though.
a live stream of me trauma dumping in the White House briefing room. No, but. The Politico piece kept saying like, oh, these new media people are so weird. They wear bright colors and fancy shoes in the briefing room. I'm like, what? Everyone wears bright. I mean, it's DC, so a lot of people dress very drab. But
it's amazing how many reporters dress homeless.
That's mean to homeless people. No, seriously. There are some better dressed homeless people than the people in there. I mean, for like 2 solid weeks, the White House beat was Natalie Winters' skirts.
It was pretty surreal to see Mike Allen in the new media seat. I mean, he's been in Washington since the Bush years or before then. He was a major reporter, and he used to really care, and he used to wake up at 3. I used to tell my reporters that be in the office by 7. Mike Allen's already published his piece. Like, you need to be at work, and it was the guy to beat. Although now he's kind of in semi-retirement, I guess, well-deserved. So have they been in private? When I know that they're mean to you on Twitter, they're mean to you in public, they say all these awful things, but in private, do they have the guts to be mean, or are they kind of friendly? You got to hang out every day.
Well, I like to think of myself as endearing and charming. I can win them over. So they're nice to me in person. I don't really hang out with them all that much. But I think when it comes down
they're like the mean girls who leave Post-it notes on the refrigerator, like you didn't clean the sink, a college roommate style. It's very passive-aggressive in there.
It's very weird, the setup of the briefing room. The fridge where everyone keeps their food is right next to the restroom. And the restroom split is very weird. They have one all gender one and then one for women. And that's it.
Yeah, this one's for ladies and this one is,
for everyone
take
else.
your life in your own hands.
I actually love that bathroom because I will stand waiting in line because there's literally, like I said, 2 bathrooms. And I get to hear all the reporters grovel and be really apoplectic over what President Trump is doing. It was my probably first or second day there.
So that's another question. I've only been a few times this administration, but the last administration was so different. I mean, I remember Caitlin Collins screaming at the president about Ukraine or Russia or something during an Easter egg roll with children. And Acosta was up there at the front every day. And this time they applaud him. He doesn't come out that often, but they seem almost polite, tame. And some of the worst, most loud people now have been sent to Substack. So have you this shift that we've seen in public towards decorum, I think in American people who are just tired of all the outrage, do you see that expressed when the conferences are over, or are people raging and just seething inside, like that emoji of the smiling guy and he's crying behind the mask?
Well, I don't really even think it's so much about me as it is me being a representation of my audience, and I think that maybe the one thing that I have taken from all of my interactions with the whole, gamut of the legacy media people is just an utter contempt for what they view the War Room audience as being, like the American working class, the truck drivers who listen to War Room. They just have nothing resembling respect for them. I think they think that their audiences are superior. And sure, we can have a nuanced debate about some of the questions that have been asked in some of the briefings. I personally probably would not have asked about what, President Trump's diet was per se. But the idea of putting
McDonald's.
well, that
Diet
and his
Coke.
workout regimen. No,
Golfing.
yeah, there you go. Hey, love me some golf. But I think it's that aversion to having new media there asking questions, which for the most part I think have been, above board. It's not really about the questions. It's just about the fact that they think that their audience is more deserving than the audience of, say, War Room or The Blaze or these right-wing media shows, because they don't think that they should have a say in the briefing room, right? Who is to adjudicate what you should or shouldn't be asking about, right? These people think they have. And I think the other point that I made to the CNN reporter, though he cut it out, I wonder why, is that this idea that it's just the Trump administration that has rolled out a new media initiative, I also think is complete BS and a limited hangout in the sense.
I saw the TikTokers and the Biden administration.
Well, I wasn't
Creepy.
even going to go there. I was going to go, I think, frankly, more sinister, and it's hard to beat that. But that is the mass and robust government censorship operation that the Biden regime had, right? Working in tandem in some cases with these legacy media outlets, but also very intimately and intricately with a lot of these big tech platforms, right? Kind of bullying them. I know I don't necessarily believe Mark Zuckerberg. I think a lot of those techie types would have done it on their own will, but nonetheless, there were those back channels that they used to set up really massive censorship, whether it was the COVID vaccine stuff, it was the COVID origins, the Ukraine war, take your pick. So I think the point that I have made, even if you give the least charitable depiction of what the new media initiative is, which is, as Mother Jones called us, a bunch of state propagandists running around the White House, at least
Mother Jones, that still exists, huh?
I know. I nagged the reporter who called me that on Twitter. She was like, "You're a state propagandist." I was like, "Girl, you have like 100 tweets saying that you think like Trump should be attacked in public. Like, okay, we're not dealing with the same levels of bias." But at least the Trump new media initiative is being done above board in public and in your face, right? The Biden regime new media stuff, one, it was passing around cards with questions, right? Courtney Subramanian having them ask certain questions that were advanced or rehearsed. Or two, it was actually just censoring Americans on these, social media platforms. So I would love to have that discussion, and I will let you ask your next question after this. But I think the other thing, too, there's such an obsession from these legacy media types with the new media now, right? Like, they're obsessed with it. It's all, leading up to the White House Correspondents' Dinner, it was all they could cover. And not
I almost
once.
missed that dinner. It had less fanfare than ever. I definitely
I
missed
kind
the
of wanted to
dinner.
go. But then I was like, I don't know if I can.
Skip
I
it.
like the cringe. But they never invite us on for like live interviews to defend what we're doing, right? I just think it's interesting to spend so much of your airtime vamping about how awful this one thing is. I would go on any network to defend it, and they won't invite us on. And I would think that you would want to talk, right, to the people who you're impugning or attacking as, Kim Jong-un with highlights, and they won't. So
One of the secrets, how long have you been in D.C. now?
you're gonna make me feel old. I have lived on and off here for like 5 or 6 years. I started working for Steve when I was 18.
It's not very long. You're still good.
I know,
I'm going
but I
on
was
21
18.
years.
It was not child labor violating laws, but
One of the
barely.
secrets of Washington, aside from how big Michelle Obama actually is how stupid everybody is. It's shocking.
Are you trying to get me to talk about Michelle Obama? I will.
No.
I will. I will
It's more about-
happily. I know this is off the record.
She's in retirement now. It's the only off-the-record conversation I've ever been in that I knew was being
I
streamed.
appreciate your use of
At
pronouns.
the moment that we talked about it. But let's talk about also one thing. Conservative media, that's kind of an interesting, or center-right, or dissident media, or independent media, or MyPillow media. You've got to ask a question that you actually has a chance of getting an answer. So you can't ask the White House press spokesperson to set policy, because they're not going to be able to do that. They're going to have to circle back with you. You have to ask them something you might actually get an answer for, but you can't be obsequious. The whole point of you being there, and the reason your readers want you there, is to actually get answers to questions. So it's kind of a difficult, it's a balanced, it's a tightrope to walk. But we know that people have been mean to you, and we'll move on to deeper subjects in a moment in the media. But how have your relationships been with conservative media? Some of it some of it can be rather catty.
So
Not that
catty.
I've worked for almost every
So
publication
catty.
in DC so far, but
Well, so when I was going into the White House, I was like, I don't want to be just a traditional beat reporter. For those of you who don't know, which you probably don't, but my background was actually reporting on Chinese Communist Party infiltration, particularly.
I want to get to that next.
That's what I love to talk about. That's what I geek out on. The United Front Work Department broke a bunch of stories from the Hunter Biden hard drive. So I always did real, like actual original, primary source reporting. So the idea of doing opinion commentary was only something that sort of came into my purview. Funnily enough, how's this for a peak 2024 sentence when Steve Bannon went to prison and I had to take over his show. I couldn't fill, 4 months of airtime just rambling on about the CCP, though I would humbly push back and say that you could. But so I sort of wanted to, I think, fundamentally kind of restructure, at least to me, what the White House correspondent role meant. More so pushing back on the opposition forces, the regime media, particularly I think with this election cycle, because you saw Democrats lose all institutional levers of power, right? The House, the Senate, obviously, the presidency. So their sort of resistance strategy, which I think in the war room worldview, we've always seen them sort of model after what we call the color revolution, right? Fomenting these pro-democratic revolutions and changes abroad is now sort
And
of
domestically.
now they're doing it here, right? You have the same people like Norm Eisen, a lot of that lawfare crew. And in addition to, I think, the activist judiciary, which we've seen people like, Judge Boasberg, those types, although it's an interesting morality trying to turn around fights midair, I digress on that point. But, the media, I think, uniquely has, it's always been the opposition media. They don't like being called that. I've tried calling them that to their face. It's very fun. When I do my live shots, I just stand right next to all the press gaggles. And Steve's like, so does the media need to go to prison? I'm like, yeah, let's do it. And they're like, but all of that to say, I think War Room has taken the role in sort of a unique way where we're not just like reporting on the news of the day. I view myself as having a front row seat, less so to what the White House is doing and more to what the sort of opposition forces are doing, at least from the information warfare perspective. But yeah, there's a lot of, honestly, like kind of funny infighting, cattiness between some of the conservative outlets. I don't really even go to the White House that much. I know no one is live streaming this, so Steve won't call me out. But I don't really need to be there all that much because a lot of my reporting is just, it's not actually what's going on at the White House. It's sort of tangential or peripheral to it. But yeah, there's some back and forth over saving seats. And when people raise their hands, if you're blocking someone's face, that's apparently a really big deal. So I'm like,
It's like an eternal line at Southwest Airlines, forever and ever and ever.
more like Frontier, but yeah.
So China's in the news today. Stanford, the students over there broke a phenomenal story, an investigative story about the influence operations, the spying, the handling of Chinese students going on. You and I have both publicly called for deporting all Chinese students.
All 350,000.
No, don't fight law cases to get them into Harvard. Send them to China. Get out. But
Full send.
where are we with this? Are you getting any sympathy from the administration? Any kind of feedback from the administration on this? Is this a bridge too far? Is this something that you have any input, any knowledge of it being considered or batted around? I feel like a lot of people look at those folks who come to China from America and assume that they have not had their stamps personally approved by the government, but all of them have. They're mostly the children of party officials. And even those who just want to get an education and want to play beer pong and want to hang out have family in China who can be threatened, they can be leveraged, they can be put at risk, and they can be put to work.
Well, and there's a deserving American who I think would happily take their spot. But I think to roll this all back to sort of the beginning of it with what the Trump administration did, cracking down on Confucius Institutes. And I think Confucius Institutes are sort of the tip of the iceberg, really the only public-facing, I think, front of what the Chinese Communist Party has done in terms of their infiltration, particularly when you confine it to college campuses. Of course, they have their sister component, which is the Confucius classrooms, which are active K through 12. In some cases, there was, I remember, a school in Washington where they had second graders doing a pen pal program with Xi Jinping, talking about how China's military was really cool. I was like, I don't know. I don't have kids, but I don't think I'd want them writing.
Who are you talking to on that chat room?
Oh, Xi Jinping. But the Confucius Institute's right, they essentially shuttered under President Trump. Funnily enough, the Confucius Institute U.S. Center, which was one of the main hubs, was operating out of D.C. They actually were one of the largest sponsors of the National Press Club, which refused my membership application. I wonder why. I digress.
Their newspapers are in the congressional galleries. When
Well,
I got
and-
marched in to answer questions about the Daily Caller News Foundation, the World People Daily was on the table.
Well, and you're bearing the lead because then the rest of the papers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, then they're paying to put the inserts in those pages too. And by the way, one of the first stories that ever broke was about the China-United States Exchange Foundation, which is one of these United Front Work Department groups. So that's a multi-billion-dollar political warfare operation that's completely controlled by Beijing, the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. But one of their go-to tactics was taking and flying these journalists overseas on trips to China in exchange for, quote, favorable coverage and to, quote, disseminate positive messages. Those quotes come from FARA filings. I'm a big advocate of FARA. I love FARA. I always joke I'm probably the only American that's ever actually on the FARA website. That's not a bot. But they use those tactics on academic types, think tankers, former members of Congress, even Hill staffers. So if QSEF wants to take you on a trip to China, I would very humbly suggest that you don't go because they will compromise you.
Or
Hunter
at least
Biden
leave your
style.
cell phone behind.
Yeah, definitely. Don't take the Huawei phone. But back to your original question. And laying all that out, right, it's obvious that the CCP has always preferred infiltration as opposed to invasion. They don't want stuff to turn kinetic, so they've waged, whether it's economic warfare, information warfare, their three warfares doctrine. They care very much about lawfare, media warfare, and psychological warfare. So when you see all that going on, why the United States would ever allow 350,000 plus Chinese nationals on their college campuses, which even the most charitable description of that being, oh, well, we're educating, the next person who's going to be in line running or creating the technologies that China is going to be using in their, military civil fusion strategy to defeat the United States. I'm going to humbly push back on that. But I think the really wonderful reporting that you were alluding to that had come out from those Stanford kids today shows, I think, just how deep it goes, because I think so often the campus issue of the CCP threat gets sort of reduced to what goes on in the Confucius Institutes, which is more of the sort of cultural stuff, though they certainly, shall we say, engaged in COVID times, and they were like sending emails and stuff to organizations being like, hey, it'd be really great if you could put out a press release saying that COVID totally didn't develop at the Wuhan lab. But there's these things called the Chinese Students and Scholars Association, which effectively run more so as the kind of personnel hub controlling every foreign Chinese student who is on these campuses. And I think the most important, statute probably in Chinese law is Article 7 of their national intelligence law, which allows them, the Chinese state, to requisition any person, company, entity, you name it. It's very intentionally vague to achieve any purpose deemed as, promoting or advancing the national security interests of the Chinese Communist Party at the behest of their Ministry of State Security. And that's the real threat when you get to these Chinese students. It's not that they're going to, put some pro-China, whatever, flyers around college campuses. It's that they're spying. It's that they're collecting intel. And it's that in some cases, it's not just intellectual property theft. I think that's sort of a reductive way. I mean, they're stealing hardcore military technology. I mean, you've seen the cases happen, DOJ indictment after DOJ indictment, and so much so that it's been codified and sort of institutionalized into the Thousand Talents plan, where you see this weird sort of, dichotomous universe where you have American researchers taking both our taxpayer dollars, but also Chinese funds to research whether it's, weird gain-of-function chimeric viruses in Wuhan or weird chips that have application with military technology. I have, as you know, in the War Room, we've, crusaded against this for I don't even know how long. I have not, heard anything in terms of reception on the Chinese visa front. I think we have maintained, and probably a little anomalous to most of conservative media, not being opposed to revoking visas of, anti-Israel college demonstrators. I mean, you can kick them all out if they're terrorist sympathizers, though I would use that, term selectively and carefully. But I just think that the framing of it that we have been very adamant on advocating for in the War Room is that you're deporting students and ideologies that are anti-American. And
It seems like Hezbollah is less of a threat to the United States than China. Maybe.
They're different threats because, Hezbollah is obviously more of a kinetic adversary, though I think...
Not to the United States, though.
Well, tangentially, right, once removed, layers removed, and we've obviously been against intervention in Iran, but I think that the China threat, though, of course, there's obviously, overlap in some ways of funding and stuff like that with Hezbollah. They don't want to go kinetic, right? From Sun Tzu, from their approach to the art of war, they don't, once you go kinetic, you've lost. So they prefer to infiltrate, which is why I would argue in, the 21st century, the times we're living in now, allowing these students on campus, it is tantamount to having, Hezbollah soldiers from the Chinese conception of what constitutes warfare on campus. And who's to say if something breaks out in the South China Sea? You have those students in addition to the thousands of Chinese nationals that cross Joe Biden's border. What happens?
What if we said that they could come here, but they had to study liberal arts?
Ugh.
No STEM.
Then we definitely have to deport
and
them.
and then send them back to China to wreck their country, like the liberal arts students wreck ours.
Gender studies.
Gender studies only. That's it.
I mean, maybe that's a good idea, but still, I just think, I think this touches too on some of the H-1B debate that we had in the war room, Bannon versus Musk. And I think it just goes back fundamentally, and maybe we're just hardcore America firsters, but I mean, maybe it's my own personal experience having applied to college, but it's not that these universities are accepting these foreign students because they're so uniquely brilliant and that you can't find that talent here in the United States.
And they pay the full
They're
rent.
doing it because of financial reasons, right? I love all the reporting on, China donated X amount to this university, though we never know what that X amount is because they don't have to disclose it, right? That's all by design. But these tuition payments are essentially, in-kind or financial bribes, right? And I think it works with the sort of donations that they give. Take, for example, Harvard's Ash Center. And here's where I think this is the nefarious part where it does ultimately affect us here at home. This group is funded very heavily by a bunch of Chinese state-run companies. They have a center where they study China, and they put out polling saying that Xi Jinping enjoys like 90+% popularity ratings, which I don't think is true, saying that he's a great ruler. This group was actually training leaders from the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, which is the group that essentially oversees the Uyghur genocide. So I guess naturally Harvard would be like, those guys, those are the ones that we want. And they would take them around DC and train them how to better administer Xinjiang province. It was quite wild. But that same Ash Center, who also gets funding from the State Department and USAID and a bunch of government agencies, they're also now the home to, for those of you who work on the Hill, I'm sure you know who Pramila Jayapal is, but she's been talking about her resistance labs against President Trump and how they've been working particularly with the Ash Center. So you have a Chinese-funded, Harvard cutout working with Democratic members of Congress to create resistance strategies to Trump. And to tie this all back to what we were talking about, which is the color revolution stuff, you're not dealing with run-of-the-mill, let's protest against what President Trump is doing, let's put on the pink hats, feminism is great. You're dealing with regime change tactics. You're dealing with political warfare a la, Chinese Communist Party, a la Eastern European style revolution. And the chick who runs it, who uses they, them pronouns, so I will be adamant and use she, her pronouns. But her whole CV, it reads like a terrorist rap sheet. She's not writing about, how to have the most efficient protests and make the best, Soros-funded signs. This is someone who studies regime change, violent versus nonviolent protest, if terrorism is effective. That was like a paper that she wrote. And my conclusion from reading all of her canon of work is that these people are not, and maybe it's because they've just become so numb to it. When you're in business with the Chinese Communist Party, you're probably naturally going to become more authoritarian and a weaponized form of government. We certainly saw that under Joe Biden. But right now, people like that, the Jayapals of the world, the they them's name is Erica Chenoweth.
Xi Jinping.
There you go. But they don't oppose violent protest right now just because they think nonviolent protest is more efficient and effective in achieving their goals. And that's a very concerning proposition, right? When you have a Democratic member of Congress partnering with a Harvard institution that's saying, yeah, for now, let's keep it nonviolent only because that's more effective in terms of opposing Trump.
This is an interesting fascination for you. I assume you also collect magic cards and paint Warhammer, but what drew you initially to this fascination to develop an expertise in it and to say, this is my focus, and if my boss ever gets sent to prison, I'm going to devote my show to this?
Autism? No.
Weaponized autism is an important thing in Washington.
I always say weaponized autism has done more for this country than the Weaponization Committee. It's true. It's very true.
It's great in a newsroom.
The story of it is really, so, okay, I had been a huge Bannon fangirl, while I was in high school growing up
Steve did
in
this to
LA,
you.
because that's what every 16-year-old girl is like. Steve Bannon's Oxford Union speech. That's cool. But it was so when I started like working for him and previously with Raheem Kassam over at the National Pulse, I definitely subscribed to his sort of, I think, more anti-globalist orientation of, the world order, the Chinese Communist Party being the foremost threat, at least from an economic warfare perspective. And I was surrounded by all these brilliant, and I don't mean this in an offensive way, but boomers. And though I agreed with their worldview, right, that the CCP had infiltrated, DC and frankly the country writ large, they thought I was like a genius because I could pull up a deleted web page and I knew how to like algorithmically search the internet. I'm not a woman in STEM. I'm not particularly good at that, but I was good enough to be able to sleuth and find, I think, a lot of reports that genuinely were exclusive at the time and original stories. But I was so blessed, I think, I've had access to people like, Bannon and Navarro and a lot of the, OG China hawks. And I gained so much, I think, information from them from a worldview perspective. I then I always say like reverse engineered and tried to footnote a lot of the statements that they were making. And then when COVID happened, all anyone wanted to read was like, this person is compromised by the Chinese Communist Party. This person is compromised. So it was, I was pro-COVID. No, I'm kidding.
I don't want to ask you, I don't want to bother you too much about Steve's life, but it was an interesting, what's it, is it called a white pill? Is that the opposite of a black pill?
Yes.
I don't know.
Fact check, true.
When to find out that Besant was a friend of Bannon and someone who was recommended by Bannon.
Yeah, on War Room many, many times.
That's interesting. I saw him at first and I said, Wall Street guy, can't trust him, gonna screw us on this trade deal. But Bannon's always been very strong on China. And right now he asked the White House, what is the goal of this trade war with China? Is it to sell more iPhones and Teslas in China, which doesn't seem like a very noble goal, or is it to isolate them from a world bloc of free and unfree countries that isolate them and hold them accountable for lying and stealing and spying?
So I'm getting PTSD because I just did this interview with some like...
I trigger that sometimes.
in a good way, with this like globalist British journalist. It was a beautiful setting behind me, but he was like, well, Natalie, I think you're wrong. The reason why China is out-competing, I don't know what this accent is, he was British, right? The reason why China's
I have a
out-competing...
Boston accent, I can bring that out for you.
There you go.
There we go.
The reason why China's out-competing the United States is because they just work smarter and harder. And I was like, I think you mean slave labor. And when I said that, I clipped it. And now, ever since then, I've been getting attacked relentlessly by Chinese state media, the Wu Mao, that's their like digital
They're very
army.
sensitive. It's strange
They
how
really
sensitive
are.
They
So I was like,
started
okay, so
following
you are using slave labor. Like, I got you. I mean, I think the satellite images prove that. No. And then he was like, and then he was like, no, really, they're smart. They've done so much. I was like, well, yeah, when you pay your workers 15 cents a day. He's like, oh, no, their wages have increased. I was like, okay, 16? That being said, maybe that's why I don't get invited on legacy media. But to answer your question, I think the Bannon War Room, even touching on what I was kind of talking about, is that it is a reorientation fundamentally of the global world order, whereby I think if you view the Chinese Communist Party as the existential threat that is seeking to replace the United States as the global hegemon, they're not content with a bipolar world order. They want a unipolar world order whereby they are, the dominant, whether it's currency, country, geopolitically. I think you've seen it with what they tried to endeavor by doing on the Belt and Road Initiative with Made in China 2025.
So do you have faith that Besant will be able to isolate China? Is that the goal here?
I mean, I think we were living on borrowed time to begin with, and I'm not even talking about the $37 trillion, debt and deficit and all that stuff. I just think this illusion that our economy, obviously it's very strong, but it was a house of cards, and I think that we had to do something. And, to some extent, some of the tariffs, when I saw the numbers, okay, 10% across the board.
Except for Vatican
the
City.
Penguin Islands, okay. But I think that it was informed by what they had learned from, the phase one trade deal, right, where, Peter Navarro and Lighthizer had been negotiating extensively. Steve was there too, with their Chinese counterparts. And finally, when they got the deal on the table where the Chinese had to commit to not engaging in, cyber espionage and the intellectual property theft and the, all the, the 7 deadly sins that Navarro had written about in his book, that they wouldn't sign it because they couldn't commit to it. So then COVID happens and you get sort of a watered down one, but essentially they then just outsourced, right, all of their production, whether it was Vietnam or Mexico. So I think that to justify the across the board tariffs approach, any country that they would not have tariffed, China would have just moved production there. I mean, it's sort of
They did that under Biden.
well, Biden, if Biden even wanted to tariff the Chinese Communist Party, I know he kept some of the Trump ones, but he couldn't have, even if he wanted to, he was so compromised. I mean,
Well,
I
they
always
moved
say
their product
he
to
couldn't have put
Mexico,
America
too.
first if he wanted to.
Yeah,
And he
I
does,
think
and he
that's right.
doesn't want to, right? He's beholden to his corporate donor class, and I think, frankly, that was kind of the brilliance of these tariffs. It was a day, love him or hate him, where President Trump, I think, actually, all the stock market fear porn that we saw going down when they were trying to crash it, it was at least a day where the most important metric, I think, to the president was not necessarily the stock market, but it was working class Americans who, for the most part, are not heavily invested in the stock market. And I know that might sound like sacrilege, but I'm sure, you guys are young. Some of the conversations that you've maybe had among some of your young peers is it's like, let's give this country a fighting chance. I'd rather have our jobs reshored and not be relying on the Chinese Communist Party at age whatever. It's just a weird thing, I think,
It'd be strange to be a vassal
prioritize
state.
heavily invested boomers over, young 20-something-year-olds who can't get a job and are seeing their jobs outsourced, whether inside the country to, H-1B visa recipients or otherwise. The only thing that I maybe would have put on the tariffs too, and I'm still waiting for, we'll see how the H-1B visa debate ends, though I think there's an interesting Semaphore article that sort of alluded to War Room winning the issue, winning the debate. I think I would have put very heavy work visa, ending the optional practical training program, ending or at least curtailing a lot of the H-1B visa stuff, rolling back some of the ideas where the spouses of these H-1B people get like the F-2, all the crazy visas, or that you don't really check in if you're a student, then you automatically get the work provisions. I think that would have been a nice addition and complement to what they were trying to do with the tariff and trade stuff.
Well, India might have a draft that will take care of that soon enough. I mean, sounds like they're getting pretty busy.
Don't
in
get me
that corner
started
of
on
the world.
India.
Navarro got in a little bit of a spat with Elon Musk, and I remember people were worried that maybe he'd be isolated. You had to remember that, I guess, Navarro did go to prison for Donald Trump, and that isn't easily forgotten loyalty. But speaking of Elon, who is the most famous, wealthy person in the world who's ever unfollowed you on Twitter, and why?
I don't know why he unfollowed me. He used to share my stuff.
He's a
and then
mercurial man, a strange person.
He subscribed, and then suddenly, it's all good.
All right, great. Well, I think we're going to go to off the record now and switch to question and
Elon
answer time.
answer.
I assume that the large audience of gentlemen in the crowd hasn't all come here for me, and you might have some questions here.